Hi everyone, I'm Eilina Armstrong, VP of Editorial with SC Magazine, welcoming you to yet another edition of SC in Focus. And here with me now at RSA in San Francisco is Andy Chow, co-founder and CTO of Coverity, which offers development testing products to automatically test source code. So thank you so much for joining us here.
Thank you for having me.
So there's likely not a security professional around, and certainly I think there probably are a few developers out there who would not agree that security should be built in from the get-go, whether it be software product, application, whatever. But problems still exist. So first off, what's the disconnect, and what can companies do better to ease this process?
Well, I think part of the problem has been that security has been a very reactive kind of activity for a lot of organizations, and development is fundamentally a very proactive one. And so I think part of the problem is not really addressing security early enough in the software development process. So for example, bringing security into the requirements process, bringing security into the way that the code is written, and bringing security into the way it's tested. And so I think bringing all of those activities earlier in the process can really help make it more efficient and cheaper and easier to build software security in, as opposed to trying to test it in or trying to patch things after the fact. Now, you're never going to get rid of patching entirely, but I think by taking a more proactive approach, companies can really reduce the number of incidents that are out there.
And certainly getting developers and security professionals to work a lot more closely together would help the process.
Yeah, frankly, there's a really big cultural gap there. I think that security professionals and developers have famously not always gotten along. And I think part of it has to do with process, and part of it has to do with the fact that they're just in different organizations. And development has a fundamentally different goal than security, right? They're there to deliver products and services that add value, and they have deadlines, and they have bonuses attached to those deadlines. And security looks like a thing that's in the way of them getting their job done. Whereas from the security perspective, there are huge risks in the applications that are being developed. And developers don't always pay attention to the small things that they could do much earlier that could really reduce those risks. And so, there's just tension, right? And I think traditionally that tension has resulted in a fair amount of friction, but over time, I think many organizations at the forefront of this have really learned how to bake things in more efficiently. And it doesn't have to be a confrontational relationship. If they work together and realize they have common goals, and they can work on the same kinds of activities that really help security and help deliver better products.
Very good. And certainly working on those goals early on and really understanding that process would be most helpful, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
One of the things, just a small example, often security organizations, when they do an assessment of an application, they'll come out with a report that says, here's a pile of vulnerabilities to address, and there's a PDF document they hand back to developers and say, go do something about this. Developers don't work that way, right? They have bug tracking systems. They have processes for dealing with all sorts of problems. Security is not the only organization that has a stake in their time, right? So QA, of course, customers and the fires that they have definitely play a role. And so, how can you work with the existing processes that development uses to triage and prioritize their work? I think is critically important for security to be effective.
Very good.
Yeah.
So, third-party apps. We've been hearing a lot about the vulnerabilities in these applications. There are some individuals who say, professionals out there who say, you know what, maybe there are so many third-party apps that are just riddled with vulnerabilities, so you should throw them out. But many can't. Their end users are depending on these to do their day-to-day jobs. How can organizations get a better handle on the vulnerabilities in many of these third-party applications?
So certainly applications such as Java browser plugins have been in the headlines, and I think there's been calls by some in the government, for example, to say, just turn it off. If you don't need it, turn it off. And for some users that might be viable, right, because they really don't have any use for it necessarily in the browser, but for other users it's not viable. They have applications that are critical. I think that a lot of security, like I said, is about dealing with the problem after the software is already out there, right? And when that happens, you really have only a few choices, right? You can put mitigations in place, you can patch, you can keep your software up to date, but there's limited options, right? I think that by focusing on earlier stage interventions, that you can get the software out there before it has vulnerabilities. the fact that people are testing the software for security after it's already out there, I think is just a really late stage intervention. A 0-day is fundamentally a flaw in software that's already out there and released, right? Why not catch it earlier so it never has a chance to see the light of day? So that's our perspective on the problem, and I think that while, the vast majority of like if you look at the vendors at RSA this year, like probably 90% of them are all about what to do about deployed software.
Sure.
Right? And who's really looking at the root of the problem? I think there's relatively little attention being paid to that, partly because a lot of organizations only buy the software; they don't develop it themselves, right? But they also do develop web applications, right, and internal applications that do have developers and who do have vulnerabilities, right? And they can do something about those proactively. So, I'm not saying that you don't want to do anything, with third-party software. I think that really the focus should be on building it right in the first place.
Very good. But in the meantime, then, you just have to look at these secondary mitigating factors to kind of catch those.
Well, we've been dealing with the short-term approach
Yeah.
of patching and trying to deal with bad software for a long time now.
Yeah.
I mean, at some point, someone's got to say, what do we do to avoid the problem, right, in the first place? And I think, the cybersecurity legislation doesn't really get all the way there, but it's starting to raise the bar in terms of attention level paid to this problem, right? Because, as a user, right, if I click on an email attachment, why should I expect that to take over my machine, right?
True.
Why should I expect that? It shouldn't have to do that. It looks like a file that opens up in Word or whatever other application. Why shouldn't it just work? I mean, it's buggy software, ultimately, that results in that. And, people have expectations built in now that they have to train everybody for this stuff. And yes, but really, can we live with that, forever, right? And I think that's something we really need to think about.
So here we are. We're at RSA. We've got, usually every year we hear some issue, some threat, some technology really kind of come to the fore when it comes to the discussion points at this conference. What are you expecting? What do you think will be the most often discussed issue at the conference?
Yeah, one of the things that we've been watching is this new cybersecurity push in the federal government, and one of the things that didn't really get a lot of play in the press, but I think is really interesting, is that the National Defense Authorization Act of 2013 essentially mandated that the DoD put together a strategy for many aspects of cybersecurity, including one that is important to us, which is software assurance. And that's a really fundamental change, I think, and it's the beginnings, right? It's only for one department of the federal government, but I think it's the beginnings of something much bigger, and I think we'll see that coming. And I think there'll be a lot of discussion about what's actually happening, what are the decision makers within the government thinking, or how are they collaborating with the industry to figure out how to solve this big problem.
And that was my next question, actually, given the fact that, we are seeing some of these cyber mandates or even a guidance now that recently came out from the White House, push this notion of having the critical infrastructure companies work more closely with agencies. Would you expect then to see the software assurance program and guidelines kind of reach some of these private companies?
Absolutely. I mean, part of what the federal government has considered doing is not necessarily mandating at this stage, but starting to put in place the idea that a software that's acquired by the government is going to have to meet some basic software assurance standards. It's a very tough thing to apply intelligently, right? I mean, software is a very diverse thing, right? It's not just one kind of software we're talking about. Software that goes into a weapon system is very different from a web application or an online banking system or something that manages the power grid. And so I think it really depends on how intelligent they are about essentially having that standard crafted to the particular domains that they have to apply to. And if they can do that right, I think it can have a huge impact on cybersecurity stance that we have in this nation.
Well, thank you so much, Andy. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
We certainly got a lot of guidance on how to deal with some of the vulnerabilities or many vulnerabilities and the software we rely on. And I want to thank Andy for being here, and thank you for joining us yet again for another edition of In Focus.